we'd like to hear a little bit about what's happening in your organisation around employee engagement. So could you take a moment just to respond to this poll? So to what extent has your strategy for employee engagement changed since the start of the crisis? So it's not at all, from not at all to fundamentally different. I'd be really interested to hear what's going on in your organisation. So what we're seeing, and Athena, if we can make sure the results are displayed. So just under half are saying that it's somewhat different to business as usual. Only a very small proportion, 6%, saying your strategy has fundamentally changed, and about a third substantially different to business as usual. So clearly a lot of action has been taken, some of it more extensive than in other organisations. Thank you very much for sharing that. So I'd like to go straight into the discussion. Sean, can we pick up the same question with you, in terms of the current state of employee engagement and what you're finding?
So I guess there's a couple of points. If organisations have decided not to do anything specific for the crisis and ask specific questions about the crisis, what we are seeing is that engagement is really high at the moment. So I think a lot of organisations are where organisations have taken action and they're using a very usual engagement kind of survey. They're getting very, very good results. So that action is actually very much appreciated by employee organisations, and the goodwill and pride in the organisation, certainly when they're doing action for the wider community, are really, really being felt. I think the interesting thing is where you have specific COVID-19 related surveys, and what we're seeing there is we've traditionally used a model around engagement which looks at things like pride and advocacy and how much you believe in the purpose of the organisation. What we're seeing is that there's probably a level below that now, which is if you want to engage your people, you really need to make sure that they feel safe, and the organisations are doing the right thing to employers. So whether that is pushing the work back in home or providing PPE or whatever, we are definitely seeing that there's a more fundamental need being asked by employees.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Jamie, are you back with us?
I am, and this is one of the biggest experiences of this crisis, right, is jumping in there to Zoom call, so apologies.
No worries. Yeah, Jamie, would you like to share some of your observations around?
Yeah, some of the things we're seeing more broadly is across the entire space of the Glint client base, we have just under 3 million data points now based on 700,000 employees being surveyed. And across the entire base of our clients, just under 60% are surveying at the moment. So that's just at the broadest view. And some of the things that that we're seeing coming out of it, that to Sean's point, the ratings and the scores coming back are actually high overall. And we're seeing that as a kind of an output of camaraderie and connectivity amongst employees with the company, and a lot of appreciation coming back for the thought and effort that's going into the action taking. So that's the general trend, is that they're actually quite high. The most common topics that are coming out in the comments from people relating to tactical elements around remote working infrastructure and tools, especially at the beginning, and as things have evolved, to Sean's point as well, we're looking at more of that kind of longer term sense of belonging and pride. But overall, we're seeing culture is a source of positivity, and workload and prioritization a cause of negativity. We're seeing that individual contributors are feeling that priorities that they have are clearer than managers do. And managers overall, their comments are indicating that they're 18 percentage points different in terms of their positivity about prioritization. So really, organizations that are helping those managers being clear on how they're laddering up to the overall company approach. And I guess as a headline metric, the rates of employee burnout overall doubled from March to April. So comments around burnout in the March to April comment analysis went from 2.7% of comments mentioning burnout to over 5.5% of the comments specifically calling out burnout as an option. And that's a kind of an overview of where we're at the moment. So burnout being the biggest theme, and obviously we can explore some of the more specific topics that fall into that, but prioritization seems to be key.
Okay, so overall, engagement scores are looking pretty good, but with certain risk factors that leaders really need to pay attention to.
Yes.
Can we just for a moment take a bit of a step backwards and talk about the drivers of engagement that we know about in the broader sense? So and what those are, and then how they relate to the current situation. So maybe you can give us just a brief recap of what are those critical drivers of engagement that we should be paying attention to, and how those apply right now.
Yeah, and I think what we're learning, and we've learned on a daily basis as a people science team, is that people want what they always want. They just want it and need it more in challenging times. So, those key topic areas around leadership, communications are front and center, especially at the earlier stages. We see that as hugely important. Resources, how enabled people are to do their job. But if we think about our old friend Maslow at the beginning, we were seeing things like, physical safety and well-being being absolutely critical. But as we start to think about the future as well, that sense of belonging and pride is a huge driver of engagement. So overall, the drivers, we haven't seen that they have changed. There's just been a different sense of priority based on where people are at in terms of their geography in the organization themselves and what's mostly driving engagement. So it's been an agile situation. We work with lots of organizations of all different shapes and sizes around the world, and our point of view at Glint would always be that HR is a driver of the business, and we've actually seen as the situation has escalated that HR's seat at the table, which is not always at the board level, has been escalated, and the voice has been very strong. So taking the feedback from employees on what they want to do in those areas, and helping drive the business strategy. So yeah, the timeframes have been much shorter. We often work with agile organizations that would engage and ask for feedback on a quarterly basis. We've worked with organizations of 100,000 plus people that are surveying more than once a week, getting that feedback through the platform into the hands of the exec and taking action on that. So huge escalation of the importance of employee engagement and becoming clearer across a much wider stakeholder base who've become involved because of the need to make decisions so quickly.
Right. Okay.
than we've seen before.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Jamie. So, so much an increased speed of surveying, speed of response, perhaps wider engagement of stakeholders. Are there any other particular engagement strategies that have really struck you? If you can maybe just pick up one or two examples before we go to some of our real life case studies. Just observations in terms of organizations who are doing this really well, some things that you've seen in action.
Yeah, I think there's two parts to that question. The design part, I think, is really important about what you're asking and why, and then the actions that are taken. So briefly, what we've seen is a mixture of, when we come to the design part, people asking regular engagement questions with a mix of distress questions in there as well. So, focusing on the well-being and safety of people. what they can do to make their customers safe as well, which is different from a traditional engagement perspective. So we've worked with customers who have a mix of that, and some customers then are going with a specific pulse and asking for feedback around the pandemic specifically. So it's a mixture and the timing. So I think really the organizations that are doing it well realized early on, and remember the time frames here are very short, but early on, that the employees understood that leadership don't have all the answers. They don't have an unlimited budget, but what they did accept was that people wanted to have a voice and wanted to be heard, and that's very much kind of, you know, taking that on board earlier on, that's done really well. So in terms of the actions that have landed really well from that type of leadership have been really focusing in on goals and priorities. People's work environment and their effectiveness to be able to do their job has been impacted in many ways. Many of us working from home, many of us losing connection in the middle of a Zoom call, right? So having continuous conversations, managers talking with their teams and asking them about their goals and how they could help possibly reduce some of their goals to allow for that change in their ability to deliver in their role. This helps directly with burnout, and that's what we're seeing is making the biggest impact. So a specific example could be one of our organizations that we work with has asked managers to introduce a weekly OKR with the members of their team, with the reporting line around well-being. What are they doing for themselves as an employee once a day or once a week to make sure that their well-being is being looked after. So yeah, really that continuous conversation, more frequent conversations about what makes them feel safe and secure and valued.
And really prioritizing the human interaction, because you're not seeing people physically on a day-to-day basis, so you really have to prioritize just checking in. How are you? Those things. Yeah, absolutely, brilliant. Can I turn to Victoria and Louise from Direct Line Group now, please? So thank you very much for joining us. And can you just share a little bit about what's going on in Direct Line at the moment, and what you've been working on?
Yeah, happy to. Good afternoon, everybody. I'll give you a run through of what's been happening in our business, and then I'll hand over to you, Louise, to see if there's anything you want to build on. Just to give a bit of context, right at the start of the crisis, our CEO came out with a very clear set of priorities for our business. Number one, to protect and safeguard our people and keep them safe, to protect our customers and continue to focus on our customers and making sure we're supporting particularly those most vulnerable groups, safeguarding the long-term future of our business to make sure that we're robust and future-proof, and then finally thinking about how we can be a force for good and support the country in their efforts, whether that's through our charity pot or through supporting local businesses who are finding it tough at the minute. So people were right at the top of that list, and they've remained there as our number one priority throughout the crisis. And I think, to your point, Jamie and Sean, that was just so well received. And to be able to give people that reassurance, we moved nearly 10,000 people to home working in a matter of weeks. We've never would have thought that possible. Even our call centres, where we've got people talking to customers and helping customers with dogs barking in the background, actually our customer scores have really increased. People have loved that we've done that for our people. We didn't furlough anybody, so we were able to reassure people that their jobs and their salaries were safe, so people didn't have that additional worry on top of everything else. We had some restructures underway, which we postponed and just said, you know what, we're just going to take away anything that could contribute to additional anxiety that you don't need right now. That's gone. We'll push that back, and obviously supported people with their needs to work flexibly with childcare and so forth. So that's the wider context. Now, what that meant for us and how we measure engagement was at early April, we were due to do our very typical standard chat survey, and have a quick dip on how people were feeling generally, which felt very inappropriate given the situation. With so many people working in completely unfamiliar ways during completely unfamiliar times, we wanted something very actionable that would provide real insight and help us as we altered our response to changing circumstances both within DLG and within the country and the world around us. So we designed a weekly survey with our partner Engage to give us really regular and relevant insight that would help both leaders, managers and HR teams to make those ongoing adjustments. And I think it was also a really good way just to show the intent and back up what we were saying. So we were saying we were people first, and actually this was a really good way to put our money where our mouth was, right, and show that we were listening and we cared and we wanted to have this ongoing regular listening tool. Now, one thing we had to be really mindful of was the huge operational pressure those big teams were under. So our big customer-facing teams, where we were literally shipping people at home, getting kit, trying to adjust to new ways of working, trying to keep customer wait times down as low as possible. Us landing something big and heavy in weekly was only going to make that worse. So we had to be very mindful of the landscape we were operating in. So Dialogue Weekly was designed to be very light touch. So it's literally 5 questions. And what we wanted to do was pull apart. So start with that overall sentiment piece. So how are you feeling generally in the context of everything going on? And then our 2 outcome questions, where actually we focused on the DLG response, the bit that we can actually control, which is how well we are supporting you and how well we're helping you to keep delivering in your role. And then we've have a couple of questions focusing on a different hot topic each week. So, so far we've looked at people's perceptions of leadership and how well our leaders are steering the business through this. We've looked at communication and whether we're getting that right in terms of content and frequency. We've looked at people management and how well our managers are continuing to lead through this time. We've looked at enablement and how equipped people are to keep delivering from a completely different place. We've looked at customer this week and perceptions on whether we're making the right choices for our customers and still being able to support them as needed. Right now, we've got this week's survey with a focus on well-being and mental health, which felt like the right time to get a read on that. A couple of things that we've done, just be mindful of, we also put in 2 optional verbatim questions at the end. So actually, what's the one thing that has really made a positive difference to you during this time, and what's the one thing that would make an even bigger difference? And that has been so valuable. So as we've seen results bounce, you can really track how people's views are shifting. So actually we could see when people's thoughts started to return to a sort of panic about returning to office and how are we going to handle that. And actually, to Jamie's point, when we could see burnout creeping in and we had some hotspots where we needed to get in and do some reprioritization. So that bit was really rich to us. And the final thing we did that I'm so pleased we did was on week 1, we captured a few additional demographic questions, which meant as well as tracking results by our standard demographics such as age and gender, we could look at those with caring responsibilities, those who would deem themselves to be more vulnerable, or someone in their household to be more vulnerable, or how are colleagues feeling who live alone, and actually being able to look at those employee groups differently has been, again, really useful and actionable to us. So just finally then, I guess how that's landed, it's been really well received within the business. Leaders and managers have been enormously grateful and hungry for that data. I think we have made a difference, which I'm really proud of in that time. Response rate started off at about 45%. We're now up to about 63%, which I think for a weekly survey is really good. And I think it shows that people are seeing the value in sharing their views. And because that hot topic is changing each week, and because we share the results and they're talked about and they're making a difference to people, we're seeing more and more people wanting to come forward and take a minute a week to share that with us. I guess finally, I thought it might be useful just to share a few of the very pragmatic things we've been able to do on the back of the insights. So number 1 was we saw straight away just the absolute the huge importance of strong leadership during this time, and our leaders are typically very visible to our business. So we wanted to really continue that. So we've set up a really good program where we are doing virtual visits. So where we have regular all the different teams in the business meeting for coffees and catch-ups or drinks on a Friday, or business meetings by video. We'll have different ExCo senior leaders just join them by video for 5 minutes to say hi, and we know the importance of actually just taking time to understand people's personal situations and show you care about that and share some of what you're going through and how you're coping. And I think it's actually the silver lining in all this is it's enabled us to have, you know, really personal quality conversations that perhaps in standard times we wouldn't have done. So we're managing to connect people much more, which is great. We've been able to see where actually the communications we were doing were at the start so well received. People were hungry and really reassured that we had high levels of communication daily. And then we saw that tip to actually now we're into a more steady state. That's actually becoming a bit overwhelming and a bit much. So we could adjust that frequency and take that call. We've seen people's needs for kit change. So at the start, people saying, yeah, no, I'm great, I'm good, I'm coping. And then actually as people start to realise we're in this for the long haul, actually I really miss my dual screen, or my chair, my kitchen chair is not going to be comfortable for the next 12 months. So we're able to catch some of those really practical things and actually act on them really quickly, which has been great. And I think that the final point for me is that it has been good at capturing the bounciness, and you can almost see people's waves where even within our team, Louise, we've seen where you just feel like, God, this week has felt tough, right? And we can see that in the data, and it's a great tool then to have that conversation and get people together and go, yeah, what do we do about that? And let's put our team calls back in, or let's do something. And so I think it has been good at sort of picking up that sentiment piecing and allowing us to respond to that.
Fantastic. Thanks, Victoria. Can I just ask how you've organised internally to respond to what you've been learning through the surveying that you've done, particularly given that, you know, everyone, the leadership team is working remotely and has to coordinate, you know, virtually as well. So how have you managed that sort of response and reaction and planning for what we're going to do as a result of what we're learning from this?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I guess there's twofold. So one, I think we were starting from a really strong place. So our sort of annual surveys were very well embedded. Managers were very well trained at getting those results, sharing them with those teams, having quality conversations, putting plans in place. So we were starting from a really good place where people were very used to doing that. And actually that has continued, and we probably now need to make sure that we're continuing with that action piece actually. So actually we're doing good things on the back of the data. I think from a leadership perspective, interestingly, it was almost, those guys had to adjust because they were trying to put the same amount of effort into the weekly survey that they would do, you know, the once or twice a year one. So it could easily become quite overwhelming. So we were saying, you know, you've got to get that balance right, that this is going to be a weekly piece. So it's getting into the rhythm of having a good review, making sure nothing's significantly shifted, or you haven't got hotspots where you need to put some effort, but maybe you have a real quality conversation about it once every 3 weeks rather than trying to do it once every one. So we've had to get that rhythm right for leaders, but I think at a manager level we're pretty well versed at dealing with the insights.
And I think having read through the comments every week, that is really appreciated by the employees. That the passion and the pride in GLG as an organisation and the leaders is coming through in the comments from the employees. So you can really see how that's building engagement within the organisation.
Okay, Louise, if I could maybe ask you to chip in at this point. I mean, what would be interesting is to understand, I think a couple of things. One is the business impact of the actions that you've undertaken and how you would assess that. And I guess the other question that would be interesting is now we're starting to think about opening up, returning to normal workplaces. What of your experience through the crisis would you want to retain? You're not necessarily going to continue, you know, with but I'm sure there'll be many things that you've learned that you will want to continue into the future. So maybe you can shed some light on those points.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. In terms of business impact, I think the first thing to recognise and be very explicit about is that as an organisation, as an industry and sector, we've been in a very fortunate position. So what we're talking about might not necessarily connect instantly with all of your experiences. As Vix has said, we didn't have to furlough staff. We've been able to guarantee salaries and guarantee jobs in a scenario where a lot of organisations haven't. That said, I think for me, my biggest reflection on this period is actually that what we've been able to do in employee engagement terms, I think has built on, accelerated and solidified a lot of what we've been doing for the last 5 years. So actually this has been quite a unifying experience for us and a bonding experience. And I would be kind of optimistic in predicting that when we run our next full survey, if ever we do, that actually I think our loyalty scores, our pride scores, etc., will have gone through the roof because of the plethora of things we've been able to do very quickly, and the way that we've been able to get this incredibly rich but simple feedback so that we can adjust and fine-tune and stay connected in the crisis, because it's one of the biggest challenges. How do you make sure that you're getting really good quality, relevant feedback at the moment that it's going to count for people? So I think from my point of view, business impact, I think it's helped drive business continuity at a very basic level. So I think it's kept people motivated and focused, and it's helped us to understand when hotspots are emerging where that's not the case and do something about it. I think it's also helped to drive our pride and reputation. So I think there's an awful lot of positives that have come through for us, but as I say, I'm aware that might not be the case for everybody. And Jill, your second question is quite a broad one, but I think what's front of mind for me and really relevant in this call is, now that we've created a culture of real dialogue, it is ironically the name for our process, our insights process and our employee insights process. But now it only used to run 6 monthly, and now it's running every week. We have got this real sense of dialogue with people. I think for me, the question is twofold. How do we maintain that going forward so that it doesn't feel like we're suddenly taking something away? But also, how can we use what we've created to help us even more anticipate and co-create a future? Because the future we're headed towards, as I guess is the case for a lot of your organisations, is likely to be much more flexible and much more individualised. And actually teamwork and feedback at that individual level is going to become even more important. So how do we really keep hold of that? And at the same time, kind of, we have to balance with it managing expectations, which is a very real conversation in our business about, how do we make sure that we're sort of not getting ahead of ourselves in terms of making promises and commitments that we can't keep, but how do we keep the dialogue open so that we are acting on insight rather than assumption?
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Louise and Victoria. Just a reminder, if you have any specific questions for any of our panelists, then please use the chat to raise those. I've also just put a question in the chat, which if you have a moment during the rest of the session to respond to, is what one action around engagement has had the biggest impact in your organisation through the crisis. So it would be great just to hear some of your feedback, if you'd be happy to share what's really made a difference for you. Great, so thanks to DLG. I'd like to shift the conversation a little bit to start thinking a bit more about the future. So I know here in the UK and in other countries, I know we have people here from all across Europe and beyond. We're starting to see very tentative steps in terms of returning to normal workplaces, and that's obviously a complex and challenging process to go through, both in terms of the coordination of it and the implications around employee sentiment and engagement. So I'd like to turn to Sean now and ask about as our members' focus is shifting away from this kind of immediate survival mode towards thinking about, how do we return to some form of normality, whatever that looks like in the future. What does that mean for engagement strategies, you know, if we think about moving from the survival to the thriving phase, how should our engagement strategies be shifting? And to Louise's point about, you know, retaining the momentum around what's worked really well into the future, what should we be thinking about there?
I think it's very similar to what Victoria and Louise mentioned. It's really about that you have that dialogue going forward with your employees about what is concerning them and what their main concerns about the return to work are. Yeah, I'd like to bring in some details of the survey that we've recently undertaken with YouGov. So this is a survey of over 2,000 UK employees, and it actually happened this weekend, so it's kind of hot off the press, and we've had very limited time to analyse it. And as such, we'd be happy to follow up with all of the CRF members on more detailed findings on an industry by industry basis after this session. So just contact us to arrange. But essentially, about over 5 in 10 people feel uncomfortable about returning to work. I think CIPD published some research this morning that said it was 4 in 10. We'd say it's more, over 5. As you expect, it's though the most uncomfortable are those who are kind of vulnerable to the virus, those living with vulnerable people, adult carers, and interestingly, those working in professional services and office-based roles, that they seem to be more. I think it's a very complicated picture, though. It very much depends on what your experience has been so far with this crisis, the industry that you work in, and also how you used to work previously, what your previous working pattern was. What we're seeing from the data is that those who are working from home currently are actually more. I think what they're saying is, it's worked for us so far, why take the risk? Those who have been furloughed have probably got a slightly different view, that getting back to work actually means more chance of keeping my job. So there's less concern in places like retail, construction, manufacturing, transport, than places like professional services and education, for example. The former industries have actually had experience of working through this, whereas professional services and education are certainly much more likely to have been either furloughed or working from home. I guess the point I'd like to raise, Gillian, is I think there's a couple of aspects of the way that we return to work that employers are thinking about. One is how they deliver the service to the customers and how the company's performing. Most of the employees in the survey think that will either improve or not suffer by returning to work, normal working patterns, whereas they're more concerned about their personal safety and personal well-being. And it's changed real down in the data. So there's important to say that there's no one size fits all with this, and it's important to take a company by company view. So what we're kind of advocating for our clients is that they almost take a decision tree approach here and go back to some fundamental questions. The first one being, do they actually need to go back to work? So speaking to Victoria and Louise, that they've taken the view that generally people can work from home going forward at DRG. However, there are certain groups within DRG, such as the recovery green flag and the people who work in the accident repair centres, who can't. They need to have a different strategy. So first question is, do you need to go back to work? The second place is, okay, what are the concerns of your people about going back to the workplace? And that's, in terms of employee engagement strategy, that's really about, you need to ask them. It's never been important to ask your people about how they're feeling. And then you can get down to the detail of the third question is, well, what are the main concerns, which I think we might come on to in the last poll, about what are the main concerns and how can you as an organisation deal with those. So I guess 2 lessons here for HR. One is asking your people how they feel and about this, and using some of the segmentation that Victoria mentioned around things like how they're vulnerable they feel, about their responsibility, etc. So to get a view of all the different types of groups you've got in the organisation, so you can ask the question about who should go back, who could go back, and who would go back to work. And I guess the last point I just say is that, coming back to what Jamie said, is that leadership has never been more crucial in this. And what we're seeing is that those who are kind of willing to try, or willing to learn and then do things differently, are having impact on on the employee engagement of their staff. So where they've shown the honesty and the humility to admit that they're learning as they go along, as we all are, that's really fostering goodwill and in their organisation. So it's amazing how prescient the session in January, the CRF session in January with Margaret Heffernan was about future insight. A lot of the things about experimentation and learning from mistakes are coming to the fore more so now than ever. So yeah, they're kind of the key points I just wanted to bring out. As I said, there's much more detail that we haven't been through. So if anybody wants more detail, please contact us.
And just to say, thanks very much, Sean. Just to say, in the notes that will be circulating after this session, we'll include a link to the YouGov poll that you've been involved in, Sean. So people will be able to see more information and look at the data. Can I just ask, Sean, in terms of the survey responses, are you able to shed a bit more light about the main concerns that people have in returning to work?
Yeah, it depends. This is where the granularity comes in. It depends on where you work and what you do. So, for example, one of the things we're seeing is that the actual commute to work is, I think, only about a quarter of people have that as a concern, but that massively rises when you talk about people who are working in London. And just looking at some of the pictures this morning on, how packed the tubes are, you can learn why that might be. Over half people who work in London, for example, are concerned about the return to work. A lot of the other concerns are around social distancing, for example, about how an organisation might enforce that, because for some workplaces that's really, really difficult. And simple things like, how do you egress the building? So things like lift management will come into play, I think, because 2 or 3 now and their work floors. So environment, it's a different, very different reality that we're all coming back to.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks very much, Sean. I'd like to turn to Andy Moat now from B&Q, and we'd love to hear a bit about your story, and perhaps, Andy, particularly to pick up on a couple of points. I think one of the key messages that has come out again and again so far in the conversation is around leadership and the important role that leaders play. So maybe if you can share a little bit about how you've tackled that in B&Q, and then thinking about, you've started reopening depots, and I think what you've done in terms of empowering local leaders to take responsibility for getting it right for their own location is really interesting. So perhaps you can share a little bit about your story and sort of focus in on those points in particular, Andy.
Sure, thanks, Gillian. Afternoon, everyone. I probably should declare at the start of this, so we haven't actually done an engagement survey during COVID yet. So, but we, nevertheless, I think we've done a lot of work to stay closer probably than ever to how colleagues are feeling and understanding their sentiments. So I'll just take you through some of what we've done in case that's useful, and pick up on those 2 points in particular. So just so you get a sense of the context of what I'm about to share with you, I guess you're probably familiar with it, but like lots of you, towards the end of March, that was a tricky week for B&Q. It was incredibly busy in our stores, and that was getting increasingly uncomfortable as we all start to understand more about the seriousness of kind of COVID-19. So it's a really strange time. And then when Boris came on and locked the country down on Sunday night, that was probably the eye of the storm for us. And then we closed the shop shortly afterwards. And then we had a chance to regroup. So we ran a click and collect operation out of our car parks, which was put together really quickly. We weren't set up to do that. We typically had a fairly traditional click and collect operation where customers ordered and came into stores and collected it. So that was very different. And we ran like that for 2 or 3 weeks, which was much safer until we understood how to operate safely in this kind of situation, but proved to be physically incredibly demanding. If you think of some of the practicalities, we were filling up all of the trolleys we had in every single store with click and collect overnight, and colleagues were doing that, and there was some big and bulky stuff that customers were trying to buy from us. So that became unsustainable. And then as we had a chance to kind of regroup a little bit, we made the decision to start with a small trial where we reopened some of our shops, completely different kind of shopping experience based around all the social distancing the government was requiring, obviously. And now we have all our stores reopened, that's proving to be much more sustainable for us. Through that journey, at the time we shut the shops, we furloughed over half of our colleagues in store, so well over 10,000 colleagues. So that was a big exercise to manage. And then subsequently, as we've reopened, we've now unfurloughed pretty much most of those store colleagues. In our head office environment, not the same numbers that the other guys talked about, but we furloughed about 70% of the office, and we still remain quite a lot of that furloughed. It isn't business as usual for us yet, obviously. We just have the stores are open and customers can come in and buy what's available on the shelves. So we're juggling quite a lot at the moment, and we've been designated an essential retailer. It's a really interesting role in a conversation we have constantly, juggling safety and fulfilling that role of people, allowing customers to come in and maintain their homes and look after themselves as well from a wellness perspective. So we've kind of been moving through that journey. I think by necessity, as I'm sure lots of you have, we've pretty much totally changed how we operate at the moment. So I'll take you through some of those examples in a minute. We're lucky we're a Microsoft business, so we've used Teams for most of what we've done. But whilst we haven't done an engagement survey, we use Yammer through Microsoft, so we can have minute by minute conversations with our colleagues. And I'll talk to you a bit about that more in a minute in terms of the volume of that. But that's been probably critical to our strategy in terms of understanding how colleagues are feeling as we've gone through this. And I think, as Gillian mentioned, the only way we've got through this is really over-indexing on how we empower our unit managers to run our shops, right down to the level that they basically decide how many customers are safe to be in their shop on a shop-by-shop basis. We can't tell them that. They understand their customers and they understand their colleagues much better than we do. And they are running the business from that perspective at the moment, and that's and long may that continue. And clearly, we all kind of know that, but I think this crisis has re-emphasised how important that local leadership is, as the people who know their colleagues best, and we've worked much more strongly in that way. It's just reminded us all how important that is. And I guess it's interesting as well because we've continued with quite a traditional, or almost re-energised a traditional kind of share cascade, if you like, right down from the board, through our directors, through our regional managers, into our unit managers, so they can brief their store colleagues. But at the same time, we're communicating directly with store colleagues more frequently than ever before. And we need to make sure those two messages align when they get to colleagues in the end. So that's been a really interesting way of working through this. So I'll just give you some kind of practical examples of the stuff we've done, so none of which I don't think is rocket science, but it's amazing, isn't it, how frequently we forget some of the things that work well. So as a board, I'm sure like your businesses, we've gone from a very traditional, probably weekly, monthly structure of weekly board sessions and monthly sessions to meeting, every day, twice a day at the start and the end of the day. And that's been incredibly productive. Much shorter, faster, frequent sessions, and decision making has increased massively. We can't get into massive debates about every single topic. We're doing a lot of work outside of those meetings and just keeping everybody updated. So that's worked incredible, and that's the kind of catalyst for everything else. At the height of the crisis, every day on Teams, we had the whole of our next level down leadership team on a call, and we'd just do half an hour, really, really punchy meeting, just running through everything that was happening in the business, because things were literally changing daily, and it was impossible to keep up without that level of frequency. Both of those things, we've dialed them down slightly now. That that was 7 days a week, obviously, at the peak of the crisis. The rhythm and routine we built up, I think, so, and colleagues are almost waiting for this now and expecting it. It's all completely new. So our operations director does a Yammer post every single night. Typically, that's read by 4,000 to 5,000 colleagues on a nightly basis, and that triggers a conversation with colleagues that flows throughout the evening. Just out of interest, our most popular time of conversation, or most busiest time in Yammer is 9 p.m. on a Wednesday night. So it's not a traditional kind of Monday to Friday 9 to 5 kind of conversation. This is people. This is become part of their lives. This conversation, how they understand what's going on in that part of their life. On Wednesdays, we've gone into that. I think probably lots of businesses are doing the classic kind of Wellness Wednesday. So I'm posting a story and trying to share something that's personally going on in my life to help us all to relate to one another. That's proving helpful for people and providing them with lots of resources, and I'm sure we all have, but a way to access the resource. And on Friday, Graham, our CEO, is filming something that gets shared with everybody. And all of those channels are available to people who are still working, and those are on furlough. And that's been critical that everybody can get access to the same information. So I guess, again, with all of us, we're trying not to create a fracture in our teams as we work through this. And we've got large numbers furloughed and unfurloughed. That's going to be really important. But probably the biggest thing, all of this is flowing through this Yammer channel I've been talking about. At the height of this kind of storm, we were monitoring Yammer sentiment, reporting it to the board 3 times a day, and it was changing really quickly. And probably the most vivid conversation I'll tell you about, it was fascinating watching it, and quite scary at the same time, just how colleagues felt about the PPE situation, their own health and safety, whether it should be open or not. And we deliberately held back a little bit and just let that conversation regulate itself, and just let those colleagues share their views and opinions. And it was one of those conversations where it was 50-50 split. People have a lot of obviously very passionate held views on that and quite different opinions on it. So we were just letting some of those conversations take place, which I think was part of the process. And then we've kind of carried on with our National People's Forum. We've accelerated that. We meet weekly throughout this with them. We're listening to them, asking for their feedback from around all of our regions, sharing the ideas. When we talked about how we wanted to furlough colleagues and some of the other things we've done, we've shared all of that on a weekly basis, which I think are incredibly valuable and another source of insight. And then we started doing things like 60 minutes with the board, using kind of a telephony system called Arcadin. If you've used it before, but a better way to do the conference calls without spending 20 minutes with people dialing in and dialing out, all that kind of stuff. And that's been really powerful, and combined with Slido to take live questions and to give people direct contact to the board. So we typically do that with about 500 of our leaders, so all of our unit managers and their equivalents in the office. And then a really simple thing we just done last week, which has been massively effective. The board personally called every single one of our unit managers. So nearly 300 conversations just to say thank you and to listen into how they were finding balancing work, and quite lonely leadership roles in this time, as we've all been kind of locked down. We don't have the normal support structures in place, and those guys have got really difficult jobs looking after all the up to 200 colleagues in some of our bigger stores. So I just think through that mixture of over-indexing on communication, we've got closer to the business than we ever have been before, actually. And I think, as other people have said, the challenge will be how do we not move backwards from that as we move back to a more traditional, attempting to move back to more traditional ways of operating. And then for us, we're just starting to think through. We work with Glint, how we would start to kind of use a more conventional survey to supplement those sources of information. And you get something different from all those different channels. Only really when you put it all together, you probably get a pretty accurate read of really how people are feeling. Lots of our colleagues are really comfortable sharing Yammer. Some colleagues aren't comfortable sharing on Yammer. So you have to always be mindful of what you may or may not be hearing. So I think that's a story of just some practical things we've done to keep in touch. As Gillian said, we're in the process. Probably most of our store colleagues who can now be working, who aren't extremely vulnerable, are back in our stores and are working again now. And we've committed to the principle of every single manager will have a contact on a weekly basis with any colleague who's furloughed, just to maintain that contact and keep them up to speed. And in some cases, it's been much more frequent than that. And that's been important in the teams coming back together again, because that doesn't happen easily. We've probably found at least a week to reintegrate somebody who's been off for a while. And we're going to have longer periods of furlough in head office roles. So I think that will be probably harder as well. So we've got to carry on working through that phase. And we're just starting to commit now, we'd like to have all of our colleagues back by the end of July. So we're starting to work through a phased programme of how we're going to do that, and how at that moment when everybody's back, how we'll celebrate that, how we'll create an event to recognise the importance of getting the team back together and then move forward and whatever new normal has emerged at that point. And as part of that, we understand how we operate stores now. We'll bring as much of that we put in place for the retail environment into our head office environment. So if you came into our head office, you'll probably see perspex screens around our reception areas, around our Costa Coffee and the canteen areas. We'll have all our kind of POS on social distancing, probably some distance marking and stuff like that. As a retail organisation, that's a nice kind of thing to see flow through the business. But equally, encouraging people not to rush back into the office, to take what we've learned from this, to be able to work from home on Microsoft Teams incredibly productively, to travel less, to have a better quality balance between work and home, I think will be important. And ultimately, the other learnings I'm sure most of us have taken, there's a leanness and simplicity that's meant we've been able to make decisions much quicker than ever before. We've developed things much quicker than we ever had before, and we can't lose those steps forward. But equally, we need to do that really thoughtfully as well. So I'm sure, like everybody else, we're just wrestling with those things at the moment. But I would say, through, and exactly to your point, it's really shown the importance of local leadership, how critical that role is, if anybody was ever in any doubt, and how over communicating with colleagues pays back in buckets. So it's been challenging, same as everybody else, but we're coming through it, I think, stronger for it.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks, Andy. I think that's a message that we've heard over and over again is when you're in a situation where we have to make decisions quickly, it's amazing what people can do, you know, whereas in the past we might have agonized over things, or there might have been all sorts of politics involved. When we have to do it, we can get on with it and make it happen. So let's hope that's a kind of mindset that we can continue once this is all over. I think a lot of people, there's been one or two questions, and I know it was something that was on my mind as well, are really curious about the experience of coming off furlough. You know, there's quite a lot of noise in the media as well, in terms of maybe a reluctance of some people to come back to work, and concerns about what that means. So do you have any sort of practical insights from your experience, Andy, to share about how to do that effectively to get people back to work when they've been off on furlough for some time?
Yeah, a few bits. I mean, I think people have talked about anxiety and uncertainty, and we've seen quite a lot of that. So some practical examples in stores. Some of our managers have invited colleagues back in before they actually came back to work, and just showing them around what the store environment is like now. Have it come in for a cup of tea, and that's really helped to settle people. It's very difficult if you haven't experienced what that's like. You weren't part of the workforce all the way through to understand what that could be like. It's, you know, totally different. So I guess where you have an opportunity to do that, whether it's virtually or in person, I think that's been helpful. But nevertheless, we have accepted not everybody has come back yet. So some for very clear reasons. You know, a lot of colleagues are over 70, so it's not right for them to come back yet. Other colleagues, it's less clear cut, so we're kind of trying to manage on a case by case basis where we can, as fairly and consistent as we can. Again, empowering the unit manager to make those ultimate decisions and supporting them to do that. And then I think we're able to adjust with our rotas occasionally. So, you know, there's some hours that are obviously customer facing and some that aren't. So that can help as well. In the office, I think we've experienced less anxiety actually around, you know, that return, because we're not actually returning to the office. You're still at home. You're just flipping up your laptop on your kitchen where you probably weren't before. But I guess it's just helping people to feel part of something still, and not have the natural anxieties about, you know, all those questions we all have about, you know, why was I on furlough and how's that made me feel, and understanding our business rationale for the phases we're restarting certain things. So close to home, we furlough almost all of our L&D team just because we're not doing that activity at the moment. Recruitment's another classic one. You know, those are quite clear cut, I guess, activity led decisions. And some where you've got volume teams, say supply chain analysts, that's less obvious. You haven't brought all your team back in one go. So I think it's just it's been maintaining contacts and trying to re-induct people as well as possible. I know a lot of our board directors have invested quite a lot of time in welcoming people back. It's easy to do that now because we've got these kind of virtual tools. But we haven't done mass kind of any bigger scale unfurlough in the office yet, so I can't really share any great wisdom or experience from that, more from a store perspective really.
Okay, that's brilliant. Thanks very much, Andy, for a really practical, insightful sharing of what you've been up to. I'm conscious that we only have a couple of minutes left, so what I'd like to do is just go around our panel and maybe ask for one final thought. And I guess there's a couple of things. I mean, we've had one question about going forward. We will have a split workforce, so we will have many more people than we're used to having working from home, but also there will be people back in their normal place of work. So, you know, how do we sort of maintain engagement across those two populations when, you know, working practices are going to be quite different? That's one point. And then perhaps if you could just share something around a pitfall that in thinking about how we look to maintain commitment in our employee commitment in our organisation over the coming months, any particular pitfalls to avoid. So I think we've got about 3 minutes left. So if I can maybe start with Sean, and we'll go around, and if you can share a brief thought.
Yeah, I guess for me it's very HR. It's around segmenting the people, understanding what your employee groups are. And the pitfall would be the opposite of that, which would be treating everybody the same, because they're obviously not. So make sure you treat people with their own individual circumstances.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Sean. Louise, how about you?
I would say your question about how to maintain engagement across two populations is really, really current for us. And I can't say I've got any clever answers at the moment because it's a really big question for us. We know that one of the things that's worked incredibly well over this period has been the fact that everybody's been in the same boat. We've all been in kitchens, sheds, sitting at ironing boards, whatever it might be. But when you move to a more mixed model, yes, I did have somebody sitting working at an ironing board. When you move to a mixed model, we know that the minute you get people back in physical meeting rooms, then the power of that presence really takes over. So I don't have a clever answer, but we're really encouraging people to reflect on what they've experienced now and what they want to take forward. And we've got a really simple exercise running in the business, which is about writing a letter to your future self. So at an individual level, what is it that you want to really keep and maintain and help others keep and maintain? Don't know if that helps.
Yeah, thanks, Louise. That's great. Jamie, final thought from you?
Yeah, I think on the two audiences point, Andy and Sean, I think, mentioned it, that the local leadership, I think, will be most important. So getting those insights to the local leadership and manager so they can have a meaningful conversation with their teams and to surface whatever their experience has been, whether it's distributed or back at the workplace. So I think that's one thing to consider with both audiences. And the pitfall would be, we've heard a lot about the pace. So I've heard the phrase pace over polish. We've gotten used to it. Maybe there's an odd comma missing here or there in comms, but if it's based on human feedback and it comes at the right time, I think people are appreciative of it. So more on the action taking and rather than action planning for months and months. I think that's something to keep.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Quick one from you, Victoria.
Sorry. Yes, I think, yeah, completely agree with all those points. I guess building on Louise, I guess one of the pitfalls, I don't know if it's just our business, but we are very data hungry. Man, we love data, and I think it's getting that balance right between not overwhelming, so actually not putting so much in so that you're always asking but not listening. Big difference. So I think it's getting that balance right between enough that you can help and shape and make a difference, but not too much that you can't do anything with it. And that's the watch for us.
Getting the balance right. Brilliant. Thanks. And Andy, final thought from you?
Yeah, it's great. I think it's as fewer rules as possible, as much flexibility as possible. In our head office, if colleagues don't want to come back and they're not ready to yet because schools aren't open, I think we'll try and accommodate as much of that as we can. And we've stopped trying to write policies that protect the 1% who might do something daft and just accept 99% of our colleagues want to do the right thing for B&Q anyway. So we don't need to write it for the 1%. So I think it's flexibility and understanding and support for us.
Okay, thank you very much. And for me, one of the themes through this whole session has been around humanizing the workplace. I think this has been a real experience in getting to know people much more deeply and displaying vulnerability in kind of, it's a bit of a cliche, but bringing your whole self to work. And I think if we can maintain some of that sense of humanity, that will make a big difference to the workplace. So a huge thank you to all of you for participating and to all of our panelists. Hope you've enjoyed the session and hope to see you again soon. Thank you very much.